Hello and welcome to my channel. In this lecture, we'll continue our talk about the CNS. So let's begin. It's time to talk about the diencephalon. It's the secretary of the brain, means that all the input going to the brain must relay in the diencephalon, except for the olfaction, the smell sensation, which goes directly to the olfactory cortex without relaying in the thalamus. It's thrown into right and left halves, and as you can see here, this is a sulcus called the hypothalamic sulcus that extends from the aqueduct of Sylvius till the lamina terminalis at the front. It divides it into dorsal diencephalon and ventral diencephalon. This is the ventral diencephalon, and this is the dorsal diencephalon. The dorsal diencephalon composed of the thalamus proper, this is the thalamus, the metathalamus, and the epithalamus. This is the epithalamus here, the pineal gland with the two habenula on the sides. The metathalamus is the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, not showing here. They are on the lateral side of the posterior surface of the thalamus. The ventral diencephalon is composed anteriorly of the hypothalamus here and the subthalamus right above the end of the midbrain, and means above the red nucleus and the substantia nigra of the midbrain. The thalamus, this egg-shaped structure is the thalamus, bounded inferiorly by the hypothalamic sulcus, showing here what's so-called the interthalamic adhesions connecting the two thalami, and of course between the two thalami is the third ventricle. It's all this area except for this one. This is the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland and the two habenula, and here we have the posterior commissure, which connects some structures, including the centers for the pupillary light reflex, and most probably the function of the posterior commissure is controlling the pupillary light reflexes. Anyway, this is the thalamus proper. This is how it looks like. On one side, it's an egg-shaped, and it has internal white fibers, myelinated fibers called the internal medullary lamina, which divides into a Y-shaped manner anteriorly, and divides the thalamus into anterior, medial, and lateral parts. Anterior, medial, and lateral parts. The thalamic nuclei, the ones you see here, are divided into four groups: anterior group, medial group, lateral group, and intralaminar group. There should be some nuclei here, like the nucleus centralis, for example, within the internal medullary lamina. Thalamic syndrome is a disorder affecting the thalamus, damage to the posterior part of the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial. By the way, if you name the nuclei of the thalamus, this is the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. This is the median and medial nuclei of the thalamus on the medial side. On the lateral side is the ventroanterior nucleus, the ventrolateral nucleus, and the ventroposterior nucleus. Between the ventroposterior and the ventrolateral is the ventrointermedius. The ventroposterior itself is divided into ventroposteromedial and ventroposterolateral thalamic nuclei. The ventroposteromedial and ventroposterolateral are the main sensory thalamic nuclei to relay sensations coming from the body. The ventroposteromedial being concerned with the head, and the ventroposterolateral is from the rest of the body. The lateral dorsal and the lateral posterior nuclei, the pulvinar at the end of the posterior aspect, with the lateral geniculate body in the visual pathway and the medial geniculate body in the auditory pathway. Thalamic syndrome, back to the thalamic syndrome, it's damage to the posterior part of the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial nuclei, means affect sensations from the body, leading to loss of sensations on the contralateral side because the fibers are crossed before relaying into the thalami, and symptomized by severe exaggerated pain. And sensory ataxia means loss of balance, cannot balance the body movement due to damage of proprioception. Proprioception are the deep sensations coming from the joints and the skin around the joints and inside the joints, information from the muscles, the status of the muscles. All these the cerebellum interprets through the ascending tracts and sends the feedback to the cerebellum to help in maintaining the equilibrium or balance of the body movements. A disorder of this proprioception leading to disorder of the function of the cerebellum. And also the patients show emotional instability in the thalamic syndrome. The epithalamus comprises the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei at the sides. This is the pineal gland and this is the habenular nucleus on each side, connected to each other. The pineal gland is composed of pinealocytes, special type of cells, and deposits of calcium called the pineal sand under the microscope, and neuroglial cells. The pineal gland atrophies with age and modifies the activity of endocrine glands, mostly by inhibiting the endocrine glands and also controlling the circadian rhythm, means the level of the hormones throughout the day and night. Some hormones increase during the day, like the cortisol, for example, and some during the night, like the growth hormone, for example. This is controlled by the pineal gland. On the other hand, the habenular nuclei, they control salivation, gastric and intestinal secretory and motor activity. When you see food or smell food, for example, or what happens if you imagine a picture of a lemon, squeezing a lemon, for example, you get salivation. This is controlled by habenular nuclei. And posterior commissure is fibers from the nucleus of Kegel in the wall of the third ventricle, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and the periaqueductal gray, and also the centers for the pupillary light reflexes in front of the oculomotor nuclei in the midbrain. These fibers decussate as posterior commissure. It's responsible, it's rather unknown, but suggests that it's responsible for the pupillary light reflex. The subthalamus, on the other hand, is connected to the basal ganglia. It's one of the basal ganglia. You can refer to the lectures about the basal nuclei in the neuro section of these anatomy lectures. This is the region of the subthalamus. It has many nuclei, subthalamic nuclei, and also many tracts that form the subthalamus. To remind you, with the fasciculus lenticularis and ansa lenticularis, these connect the subthalamus to the lentiform nucleus with its part, the putamen and globus pallidus, for example. So this is the subthalamic nucleus, or the subthalamus actually, and it's concerned with regulation of motor activity from the cortex. The hypothalamus, it's this region, bounded anteriorly by the lamina terminalis, superiorly by the hypothalamic sulcus, and posteriorly by the infundibulum that goes to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. This is the hypothalamus, thalamus, with the optic chiasma right beneath the hypothalamus. It has many nuclei. Two of these nuclei are the mammillary bodies. They are pea-sized bodies covered by fibers from the fornix and have medial and lateral mammillary nuclei. So they belong to the limbic system by their connection to the fornix. Functions of the hypothalamus is endocrine control. It has the nuclei, the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. The supraoptic nucleus is responsible for formation of the antidiuretic hormone, or the vasopressin, then goes down the axons from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary to be released from there. So it's formed in the hypothalamus but released from the posterior pituitary. So goes for the oxytocin, which is formed by the paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus and goes through the axons from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary to be released into the blood. Also, it controls the parasympathetic activity of the body. It has a biological clock. It means response to time, and you can expect that there is a connection with the optic tract, for example, to be able to perform this function. It has to do with the sexual behavior of the individual. It has to do with feeding, because the lateral zone is the feeding center, and lesion in this feeding center leads to aphasia. The medial zone is the satiety center, and lesion in this center leads to hyperphagia, means excessive eating. Also, water regulation through osmoreceptors, and it has to do with the emotional status of the individual. So it has many complex functions performed by the hypothalamus. Now, the last part of the diencephalon is the metathalamus, which is the medial and lateral geniculate bodies. Here, medial and lateral geniculate bodies. Medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. The medial geniculate body connects with the inferior colliculus because it's part of the auditory pathway. The lateral geniculate body, or the lateral geniculate nucleus, connects with the superior colliculus because it's part of the visual pathway. See the connection between the superior colliculus here and the lateral and the lateral geniculate body. It's hidden here under the pulvinar of the thalamus here. There it is, lateral geniculate body. Medial geniculate body is this one, and it's connected to the inferior colliculus by the means of the inferior brachium. So remember, the medial geniculate nucleus is part of the auditory pathway, while the lateral geniculate nucleus is part of the visual pathway. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.